I was invited actually to speak at another event at NTU, and I've been exchanging emails with Chinny for maybe the last 6 months, and she discovered I was going to be here, and she said, "Can you come and talk at our libraries event too?" And of course I said yes, and we had actually met in person late last year at the Australian Association for Research and Education conference, which was in Melbourne, and so that seemed like a great opportunity to come and just talk about some of the things that I do with my colleagues at the University of Melbourne. So our little logo here and our acronym LEARN, this is a research group at the university. The acronym stands for Learning Environments Applied Research Network, and we've been around since roughly 2009. And we're a collaboration predominantly between the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning and the Graduate School of Education. And occasionally we do some joint projects with the School of Medicine as well, because they're really interested in medical learning environments, and they actually have a lot to offer the field, not just because they have more money than anyone else, but they also, as I was speaking earlier, they're very interested in evidence-based design. And so that we actually have quite a lot to learn from the wider field of health architecture. So what I wanted to talk about today was this idea about behaviour settings and what we can learn from that in terms of understanding libraries as places for activity and as places of value to different users. So I'll sort of start to slowly introduce some of those ideas as I go. I guess firstly, this is where I spend my time. This is our new building. It's 2 years old, the Melbourne School of Design. And we're right in the middle of the campus in Parkville. It's about only less than 2 kilometres out of the centre of Melbourne. So we're very fortunate with our proximity to the city. More interestingly, I think, is the interior. It's as I said yesterday, for a few of you who are at my other presentation, it has a lot of wow factor. It's got a lot of incredible sort of design aesthetic, but I think also it carries with it a lot of sort of pedagogical expectation around what's supposed to happen in this building. And as I pointed out yesterday, this central atrium space is really the hub of all of that activity, and it's the connectedness and the visibility through the building which really makes it come alive. And the multidisciplinary activity that goes on there, because we have the 3 major disciplines of architecture, building and planning, but within them there are lots of sub-disciplines. So for instance, in architecture we have architecture, interior design, landscape architecture, etc. And the idea of our building is that all of those disciplines are visible to all of the others. And so this building is meant to embody that idea. And the richest time of year is Expo Week, where at the end of each semester the students put a lot of their work on display, and the crits happen, and industry people come, and other family members quite often. I was talking to someone about, do parents come and visit as well, and that does happen. So that's a little bit about where I spend my time. There's a few more images for you as well. But as I also said yesterday, my little niche within this faculty is in understanding human-environment relations. And so, being not a trained architect, and I'm only one of 2 as a senior lecturer in architecture, my interest is in how do people relate to space, and how does space create value, and how do we create value to space. So it's this sort of interaction or transactional experience that we have with space. And one of my favourite authors in this area is a fellow named Henri Lefebvre, who's a philosopher, not surprisingly, and he talks about user experience extensively, and how do we understand what you might call that textual experience of an environment. What are the acoustics like? What's it like sitting on that chair? What are the other things going on around that create an experience for you of that space? And this idea that, and I have to constantly promote this even in a school of architecture, that it's behaviour, not space, that's enclosed by architecture. So that if we're thinking about design, who are we thinking about? So the object, the representation of the architecture is important. But what does it offer the people who are using that space is where I contribute to the dialogue within my faculty and hopefully elsewhere as well. Because that is not necessarily the predominant dialogue going on around architecture. It should be more prominent, in my opinion. This is, I guess, what I wanted to offer the conversation today. Is some of the seminal work in environmental psychology from the 1960s and 70s, and particularly the work of a fellow named Roger Barker, who actually he was one of the promoters and the developers of that field of environmental psychology, and trying to understand human-environment relations. And he and his colleagues, particularly Gump and Chogan, they spent a lot of time observing people's behaviour and trying to understand how did the ecology or the physical environment contribute to that. And not only the physical environment, but the social environment, the cultures of practice that went with those physical environments. And so over the last few years, I've found this idea about behaviour settings theory to be incredibly powerful and incredibly useful in thinking about how does a physical and social setting actually influence what we do. And so the classic examples of behaviour settings are things like the church, where if you're attending church on a morning, you might approach that beautiful cathedral or whatever it may be, and often out the front people are chatting. It's a very lively experience, very conversational, and it's quite an excited forecourt to the church proper. But as people cross the threshold, they may be a few stairs, they cross the threshold, their demeanour changes, they quiet their voices, they become very respectful, they might sit in the pews. And so why is it that they behave like that? What is it about the design of the church, but not only the design of the church, but the behaviours of others, the expectation about how to behave is really powerful. And the idea of behaviour settings theory is that those environmental cues from the physical and also the social bring with it information about how you should behave. Very powerful information that really does shape people's behaviour. If you're a very young person, maybe you're 2 or 3, perhaps you don't recognise those cues. They're not something that is so familiar to you, you might not respond in the same way, or your own lack of inhibition might encourage you to behave a little bit more boisterously. But as an adult, you probably do recognise those cues, and that's important. So they talk about units of the environment, and what they mean by units of the environment is not just the physical. So they talk about physical components, which includes things like the time and the place, and the objects, which includes the architecture, the physical structure of buildings, for example, and the social environment, and that is the behaviour, the patterns of behaviour of others, like those people entering the church. So people respond quite powerfully to these cues. And of course, as I've sort of been illustrating, that architecture, and there's a small but interesting discourse in the literature about this, that architecture often bounds behaviour settings. So this library, for example, may be a boundary for a behaviour setting, but I haven't studied it, so I'm not exactly sure. The reading corner may bound a behaviour setting for certain reading behaviours, which Chinny illustrated. So architecture can act as the boundary between one setting and another. I would expect that in this situation that the behaviours over in the cafeteria are different from the behaviours in the library, and that the spaces are actually bounding that behaviour, and the threshold of the doorway is acting just as that, a threshold for different behaviour. So we can think about these things in those ways, and architecture can help delineate where one behaviour might be acceptable and another one might be preferred. I also think we can take behaviour settings theory and assist us in designing appropriate environments. So we can provide the physical cues, and hopefully we can also inform the social cues that might go with them. So I also talked about this a little bit yesterday, where this concept of building spaces based on our pedagogical beliefs, based on what we believe a good education will be about. What are the activities and the behaviours of students and teachers, I guess as the predominant users, what are the activities we'd really like them to see? How does those activities relate to our bigger picture beliefs? And designing environments that may be quite disciplined. The church, I think, would be an example of that. And very autonomous. And I've included an image of a library here intentionally to say that, you know, perhaps libraries, they do offer a sense of autonomy, a sense of choice. Certainly in a place like this, that's true. And we can sort of design in keeping with the behaviours we'd like to see going on and encourage people to engage in those. I guess when this becomes quite powerful is when not only have we designed for that, but people start to exhibit those behaviours, and so that's a sort of self-perpetuating process whereby if other people are doing it, we're more likely to do it as well. So if you can encourage appropriate behaviour or desired behaviour, it's more likely that other people will join in. Some of those settings that might be included in such a foray into design, you know, we actually have sort of documented lots of these over the last little while with our Learn group, but they may be sort of collaborative and shared learning, and there's a few sort of illustrative images here. Presentation performance spaces, we can see some of these exhibited in this room here. Meeting in small withdrawal spaces. Quiet reflection and reading spaces where it's just a little bit aside. Creative Makerspaces, I think we've had a few people who are interested in those, and it's nice to see that there's one not too far away. With indoor-outdoor connections. Other sort of storytelling and dialogue spaces where it's about the sort of the democratic shared experience. Obviously access to storage, again the library, the faces of the books being a really good illustration here, and other forms of storage. And I could probably go on with about 3 or 4 other slides to illustrate some other more detailed settings as well, but that gives you the idea about how does the assemblage of those different settings come together to offer a range of spaces and generate a behaviour setting for preferred behaviours. I guess the sort of bringing this together a little bit is this idea that, well, what do we want to be able to do? What do we believe around pedagogy? What are our bigger educational beliefs? And how can we create environments through building structure, through interior design, through furniture, through resources that marry with what we'd like to see those students doing? And I think the challenge that Chinee put up is, well, how do we encourage reading in this case? That's the predominant aspect of today's conversation. How do we encourage reading? What forms of reading? And what are the expected behaviours around that activity? I wanted to just finish by sharing some of the images of libraries and perhaps pointing out some of the features of those, which you can no doubt recognise for yourselves as well, from our part of the world. Mount Gambier is actually in South Australia, but very close to the Victorian border where my home state is. This is a good friend of mine, Peter Mowick, who I've actually collaborated on some schools in the past, and he does a lot of school libraries, he does a lot of public libraries, and if you're interested you can have a look at his website. But he's very interested in this idea of affect and that affective charge that you can create through design and capturing the imagination of children. And so he's created some really quite wonderful spaces. This is a tree frog that's in this whole world of whole natural world. I've got other pictures, but I didn't include them. You can see the background here, but making it a really exciting and affectively charged environment to invite people to spend time there because it's a bit different, a bit exciting, but also a little bit cosy, as you can see this girl enjoying this little nook. Some other little nooks and crannies, perhaps a little bit more traditional, but just providing those little cave-like spaces that kids really genuinely enjoy. And I can say that with great certainty that is preferred environments for reading for younger children, is cosy, protected spaces. Some other activities, it might be that you want a shared dialogue and the surface is important, and so perhaps including a variety of those settings within the same library can be important as well. I wanted to include this library. This library is at our university in one of the residential colleges, and to me this is probably one of the best libraries that I've certainly ever seen. I'll flick on to the next page. It's gloriously well designed. It's an absolutely beautiful building, originally designed by one of our very famous architects, Robin Boyd, but recently restored. Not restored actually, because that was a complete gutting and refit, but repurposed to becoming a much better library than it had been. And so it is a glorious space to be in. It's the lighting is fantastic and all of that, but the real value of this library is in fact in understanding the relationship between the physical settings and the behaviours of the students in this university context, particularly of this college. And so what you can see is a whole variety or an interconnected network of different settings. None of them, well, some of them are closed off and they're acoustically separate, but most of them are embedded in amongst other books and other resources, as you can see. Little meeting spaces, coffee table style, study spaces with wonderful views to the outside, little collaborative booths, and these are distributed throughout the library, and you can see some of them being populated here in use. And so this offers choice. It offers choice to those people occupying that space. Little things too, the detail is quite extraordinary. This little platform here acts as a speaker corner, so that they can probably have at least 200 people come to events, either seated or more standing. There's a kitchenette, there's a sort of what we call a kitchen table here, adjacent to that kitchenette for sort of shared study. And so again, it's this sort of array or network of settings that are all integrated into this one building that offer something similar but different. And you can have choice. Another library which I think Mary may have been to at ACU, which is nice. Another library which I really quite like, and my wife works across the road, and sometimes I'd sneak in here and do a few emails before I go home if we're going home together, because we work quite close together. The Raheen Library at Australian Catholic University. And again, this idea that it's offering an array of opportunities to people. And so there's quite well articulated behaviours that are expected, to the extent where, even though I don't have an image of it, they have like small cinemas, a whole variety of things. They don't have a makerspace, but perhaps that's the only thing missing in that array of opportunities in this library. And finally, I thought I'd include this one because it reminded me a bit of Singapore with the greenery. Queensland, Ipswich Resource Centre at the University of Queensland, and just creating really lovely places to be, and that being so attractive, and bringing people in, inviting them to join, to sort of join the academy, if you like, and to be around books and around people who are studying. And again, that idea that just the well-being of people can invite them into behaviours that you may well like them to exhibit. And that's the final image, I think. So thank you, and I'll pass over to our next speaker.